Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 123 called The Holy Roman Empire. In this episode, I want to move on to the final political legacy of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, the so-called Holy Roman Empire. Amazingly, this curious political institution lasted until Napoleon abolished it in 1806. In the 18th century, the French political philosopher Voltaire famously said it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And he may have been right in his own age, but it was originally born with an emphasis on all three of these aspects. And in this episode, I want to unravel how the dream of Charlemagne's empire was all but forgotten in the West, i.e. in the territories of modern France, but endured in the East for 1,000 years. So let's pick up from the last episode and finish the story of the demise of the Carolingians in the West. There, as we discussed, it was the Vikings who delivered the coup de grace. None of the Charleses, Charles the Bald, Charles the Fat, or Charles the Simple, could defeat the Vikings. At the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in the summer of 911, the Carolingian king Charles the Simple granted the lands of Normandy to the Viking warlord Rollo in return for his vassalage. Charles the Simple pretended he was still the boss, but a famous story tells us the truth. According to this account, Rollo refused to kiss Charles the Simple's foot when he was asked to swear homage to him, and instead instructed one of his men to do it for him. A huge Viking warrior stepped forward and is said to have grabbed the king's leg, lifted his foot up, and sent the king sprawling onto his back. This account is almost certainly apocryphal, written about a century later by a Frankish chronicler, Dudo of Saint-Quentin, commissioned by Richard I of Normandy to write a flattering history of the Normans. But it nevertheless captures the truth about not only the Carolingian monarch's relations with the Normans, but also with his other so-called vassals. For genuine power was in the hands of the vassals, of which Rollo the Viking was now included. Historians call this a feudal society, in which an ascending pyramid of vassalage existed, starting with the humble peasant who swore fealty to the local lord of the manor, typically a knight with just enough land and peasants to feed him and his dependents. The knight, in his turn, would swear fealty to a greater landowner, maybe a count. The count would in his turn swear allegiance to perhaps a duke, and the duke would swear his allegiance to the king. So the king was preserved at the top of the feudal pyramid, but the fatal weakness of this system for the king was that instead of having the support of a broad political base, he was beholden to a small number of great landowners who, at this time, were more powerful than him. Therefore they acted as kingmakers, normally fighting among themselves over who should take that title. In 888, these great lords deposed the Carolingian king Charles the Fat and replaced him with one of their own, the heroic Count Odo, who had led the successful defense of Paris against the Vikings in the Great Siege of 885-6. Odo was not only the saviour of Paris, but he was also the son of a powerful nobleman called Robert the Strong. Robert had gained power during the late 9th century Viking invasions when Charles the Bald proved incapable of defending France. Robert fought the Vikings, but he was best at extending his own domains. In due course, he and his sons became the Counts of Angers, Tours, Blois, Orléans, Chartres, and Paris. As such, the so-called Robertian family became stronger than the Carolingian, and this was the real reason Odo was elected king at the Carolingians' expense. However, the Carolingians weren't finished. Charles the Simple led a Carolingian comeback in 893 when a group of nobles opposed to Odo proclaimed him king. Civil war ensued. After Odo's death in 898, Charles the Simple became king of West Francia. This merry-go-round between Carolingians and Robertians continued when Charles was ousted in 922 by Robert I, Odo's brother. Robert was killed in battle a year later, but his son-in-law Rudolf succeeded him, and the Robertians retained the throne until the Carolingian Louis IV gained it in 936 and reigned for 18 years until 954. He was succeeded by the last two of the Western Carolingians, Lothair and his son Louis V. Louis died childless in 987 in a riding accident. At long last, there were no Carolingians left. In that year, a new royal dynasty, led by Hugh Capet, replaced the Carolingians. The Capetians remained the kings of France for the next 400 years. But for most of that time, true power resided with the feudal lords. For example, in 1096, when the First Crusade was launched, it wasn't the French king who led it, but the feudal barons of France, Normandy, and Sicily. The French monarchy only emerged as the strongest power in France during the 100 Years' War. But, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, one paradox of the 10th century was that as feudalism rose in the West, this wasn't the case in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, where the king remained dominant. There were many reasons for this, which we'll now consider. The first and most obvious lay with the Vikings. In the east, their impact was minimal, despite the sack of Aachen in 881 and significant raiding along the Rhineland at that time. The vast majority of the 9th century Viking raids were conducted against England, Ireland, and northern France. Therefore, the German lands of the Frankish Empire were spared the brutality of invasion, which splintered Western Francia into around 30 separate feudal baronies. Indeed, in the east, 5 main regions of Charlemagne's Eastern Empire survived, namely Saxony, Thuringia, Franconia, Swabia, and Bavaria. When the last Eastern Carolingian Louis the Child died at the age of 17 in 911, the 5 German dukes concurred that one of them should be named king. Initially, Conrad of Franconia, a Frank, was chosen. However, he was a poor choice. He quarrelled with Henry of Saxony and failed to counter the growing attacks from the Magyars. However, when he died in 918, Henry of Saxony was chosen. Henry proved to be everything his Carolingian counterparts had failed to be. Nicknamed the Fowler because he was allegedly fixing his birding nets when messengers arrived to inform him he was to be king, he was the first non-Frankish king, and as Duke of Saxony, he ruled the wealthiest and most populous region in the east. He established the Ottonian dynasty that ruled most of the lands that now form modern Germany for a century, from his accession in 919 to 1024. His credentials for kingship were certainly helped by the fact Saxony, his personal fiefdom, was the most powerful German state. But what really made him was success in war. As I mentioned, the Vikings posed little threat to the German duchies, but the enemy that did was the Magyars. Remarkably little is known about them, but they were originally a Turkish tribe with strong ties to the Huns, Pechenegs and Avars. They first appeared on the Hungarian plain in the 890s, where they joined with the remnants of the Avars who Charlemagne had defeated. They may well have also combined with Slavonic tribes, as we know their cousins the Avars did, since by 900 they were raiding in force into the eastern half of the Frankish kingdom. In 906 they'd raided west into Saxony and Thuringia. Their expeditions became increasingly daring, so that in 899 they appeared in Italy in the Po Valley. In 917 they proceeded from northern Italy into Burgundy and Provence. The Magyars were lightly armoured horse archers, similar to the Turks and Pechenegs. Unlike the Avars, they seem to have had no heavily armoured horsemen. Also, unlike the Avars, they had almost no skills at siege warfare. The only city they're known to have taken was Pavia in Lombardy. Nevertheless, their raids were difficult to counter since they were exceptionally mobile. At first it seemed as if the Magyars would be the Vikings of the East. In 924 they defeated Henry of Saxony and forced him to pay tribute. It looked as if the Eastern Frankish kingdom would go the same way as the Western kingdom. But Henry was made of sterner stuff than his Carolingian counterparts in the West, and he fought back. The story of Henry's war against the Magyars is detailed in a chronicle written by Widukind of Corvey, a Saxon monk at the Benedictine Abbey of Corvey in Germany. Although written to commemorate Henry's reign and therefore biased in his favour, it's no exaggeration to say that Henry showed the same steeliness and determination in fighting the Magyars that Alfred the Great showed in his war against the Vikings in England. Having initially bought the Magyars off with tribute, he devoted himself to rebuilding the Carolingian army, which had fallen into decay. He focused on strengthening the central Royal Guards unit, which was directly under his control, and supplementing it with regiments from the counts of the other regions. He also built fortifications across the length and breadth of the Eastern Kingdom. In 932 he was ready for war. He met the Magyar representatives who came to collect their tribute, and a little like the Emperor Marcian with Attila's Huns, he told them there would be no more tribute. The story goes that instead of a bag of silver that they were used to collecting, he gave them a dead dog. The result was the war which Henry had been preparing for. On the 15th of March 933 his army met the Magyars at Riad in Thuringia in central eastern Germany. Henry used light cavalry to engage the Magyars and lure them into making an assault on his main army, whereupon he unleashed his heavily armoured horsemen who routed them. It was a decisive victory, although it didn't destroy the Magyar threat entirely. Henry's prestige was enhanced, and when he died in 936, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was united under his rule, quite the opposite of the fragmented feudal system that existed in the West. His son Otto was 24 years old when he succeeded his father in 936. Subsequently known as Otto the Great, his reign has passed into legend even more than that of his father, and almost equals the legendary reign of Charlemagne, whom he sought to emulate. Described by Widukind as tall, athletic, and with a red beard, Otto not only looked the part, but inherited his father's ambition to bring firm government to the Eastern Empire. He was crowned King of the Franks in Aachen by the Archbishop of Mainz, who handed the young monarch a sword, declaring, quote, "Receive this sword to repulse the adversaries of Christ, the barbarians and evil Christians, as a symbol of the divine authority that is conferred on you and of your power over the empire of the Franks for the abiding peace of Christendom." End quote. Otto did not disappoint. He strengthened his authority over the dissident parts of his kingdom, taking direct control over Burgundy, which was breaking away. He held the heir to the duchy, Conrad, hostage at his court and banished the rebellious Duke Arnulf of Bavaria. His own family was used to cement marriage alliances with the German nobility, arranging for his son to marry Ida, the daughter of the Duke of Swabia, and his brother to marry Judith, daughter of the Duke of Bavaria. He supported the German church, which in return supported him. He founded a vast abbey at Magdeburg in central Germany, which became a flourishing religious and cultural centre in the heart of the so-called Ottonian Renaissance, which, for example, encouraged the production of illuminated church manuscripts, the major art form of the age. But a family squabble threatened to bring him, his kingdom, and all his achievements down. And this began with a revolt by his own son, Ludolf, against his father in 951. The reason was his fear of being disinherited, since Otto had remarried following the death of his first wife and Ludolf's mother, the English princess Edith, or in Saxon Edgitha, the granddaughter of Alfred the Great. The marriage is interesting since it represented an attempt by Otto's father, Henry the Fowler, to join the German and English Saxons closer together. This didn't happen, but on a personal level, according to Widekund of Corvey, it was a love match, and Otto was heartbroken by her untimely death from unknown causes in 946, when she was only around 36 years old. Otto was by now the most powerful man in Western Europe, and he was free to find a new wife, which offered important political opportunities. The woman he chose was Adelaide. Most historians regard her as one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. Forthright, intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious, she was Otto's match in every respect. They became the power couple of the century, a bit like the Emperor Justinian and his Empress Theodora. She also had a past, although not disreputable like Theodora's. She was a Burgundian princess who'd married Lothar, the King of Italy. When her husband died, she tried to seize the Italian throne for herself, but a nobleman called Berengar ousted her and took the throne for himself. Berengar imprisoned Adelaide in a castle at Lake Garda, but showing her feisty spirit, she escaped and appealed to Otto for help. Otto met Adelaide at Pavia in 951, and they married. Not only did Otto acquire a mesmerizing wife, but she also gave him a reason to invade Italy and add it to his domains, which he did with relative ease since Berengar's forces melted away at the sight of the Saxon army. In the same year he married Adelaide, he was proclaimed King of the Lombards, similar to Charlemagne. However, the problems began when Adelaide gave birth to their first child in 952. Otto's son Ludolf understandably feared he would be disinherited by his ambitious stepmother and rebelled against his father in 953. He secured the support of the Dukes of Franconia and Swabia, and even that of the Archbishop of Mainz, who'd first placed the crown on Otto's head. Outraged by his son's treachery, Otto mustered his army and advanced against him, forcing him to retreat to Mainz, which he besieged. However, Ludolf was a good politician and persuaded the Duke of Bavaria to throw in his lot with him. This was a major blow for Otto, who was forced to abandon the siege. Indeed, it looked as if he might have to abdicate in favour of his son. But Ludolf then made a fatal mistake. To gather more allies against his father, he cast his net wider by inviting the hated Magyar nobles to a great feast at Worms. He gave them presents of gold and silver, intending to recruit them as mercenaries. This backfired disastrously when many of his supporters deserted him, shocked at this treachery against Christendom as they perceived it. Otto sprang back into action and advanced again against his son. Ludolf retreated, gave battle at Nuremberg, which was an inconclusive if bloody contest, and finally surrendered to his father. Otto was remarkably generous. At the imperial diet at Arnstadt in December 954, he stripped his son of all of his titles, but allowed him to live, and even entrusted him with troops to reconquer Italy, which had broken away from Otto's control. The conclusion of the civil war greatly strengthened Otto's position as king of the Germans. But the Magyars were still raiding German territory in 954 as Otto and his son fought it out. They had pillaged Bavaria and Lotharingia and even advanced into Burgundy. With the civil war concluded, Otto mustered all his resources to face them. The result was the 3-day Battle of Lechfeld, fought in August 955, one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages. It began when Otto led his army towards Augsburg on the river Lech to relieve the city from a Magyar siege. Our main source on the battle, Widukind of Corvey, is limited about its details. However, he emphasises Otto was able to gather the heavy cavalry from across his entire kingdom, so that historians estimate he had as many as 8,000 mailed horsemen drawn from across Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bohemia, and Thuringia. Widukind says that these were divided into 8 legions, an anachronism referring to the Roman army, but one that provides the basis of the estimated 8,000, since in the late Roman army's recategorization of legions, a legion was counted as having 1,000 soldiers. Widukind says that as the German army was advancing on Augsburg in a long line, the Magyars attacked the flank of a Bohemian unit of heavily armoured horsemen, which they routed. The retreating Bohemians left the baggage train undefended, which proved the Magyars' undoing, since they stopped to plunder it, leaving themselves exposed to an attack by the rest of the German army. It seemed the mailed German horsemen surrounded and overwhelmed the more lightly armed Magyar horse archers. The Magyars fled with heavy losses, and the Germans subsequently captured their camp, releasing many prisoners and taking all of their plunder. Widukind has left us with some colourful details of the battle, such as the death of the courageous Duke Conrad of Lorraine, who'd turned the battle around by leading his horsemen to attack the Magyars when they were plundering the baggage train, only to be killed by a stray arrow which pierced his throat when he was loosening his chainmail coat in a pause in the fighting. Widukind says many Magyars were taken prisoner and treated brutally. Their leaders were hanged and many others executed. Some of the rank and file were sent back, missing their ears and noses. It was a turning point in European history. Never again did the Magyars raid outside Hungary. They settled on the Hungarian plains and presumably intermarried with the Slavonic population, since their Asiatic appearance and culture largely disappeared, although their language remained non-Slavonic, and modern Hungarian is related to the ancient nomadic languages of the steppes. By the year 1000, they had adopted Christianity, replaced their tribal system with a monarchy, and their king Stephen became a saint. It was a remarkable transformation, similar to the conversion of the Vikings into God-fearing Normans. The battle was also a turning point for Otto. After years of civil war, his prestige was henceforth unquestioned. Encouraged by his wife, he sought to revive the imperial ideals of Charlemagne. In Rome, on the 2nd of February 962, Pope John XII placed the imperial crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. His wife Adelaide was not to be left out. She knelt by her husband's side and was anointed empress. She ensured that Otto, the eldest surviving son of the 4 children she bore her husband, succeeded to the title as Emperor Otto II in 973. Otto and his successors called themselves Roman emperors, and although the title would be modified in the 13th century to Holy Roman Emperors, it was an inheritance that would last even longer than that of the emperors of Byzantium. The Holy Roman Empire was truly the last descendant of the once mighty Rome. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, on the 22nd of November, we'll switch our focus to the Byzantine Empire, another of the inheritors of Rome. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.